it was a very tight community back in the early days because everybody to a certain degree was working together to try to keep a sport alive that McCain and McMahon and Don King were trying to keep down because of it was affecting boxing, pro wrestling, and and they got McCain to step up behind it.
That's an interesting point. You're talking about Vince McMahon, right? WWE.
Yes.
So WWF, which turned into WWE, ended up later, 20 years later, combining with UFC. But that was the original organization trying to kill the UFC.
Absolutely.
Can you explain that for us?
Because there's only so much money available from television people on pay-per-view, and they held a strong spot in it. They whether it was 10% or 20% of the total take on pay-per-view for the year, the WWE was taking a huge percentage of that, as was professional boxing. And then all of a sudden this new sport comes in that the rules are kind of questionable. They're trying to keep it out, and it got 300,000-400,000 buys. At that point, people were like, whoa, this is competitive. We got to get these guys out. And they got John McCain, I believe he was the governor of Arizona at the time, to get behind them on a smear campaign and called called mixed martial arts human cockfight.
Yeah, I remember those days. Yeah.
Wait, did that ever bother you?
No, it didn't bother me because I knew it wasn't. I knew it wasn't like that. I always thought that was a pretty safe sport because I always came to the sport as a brawler because I grew up fighting on the streets of Memphis and I thought this was pretty safe.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it on the street. A guy gets knocked down, okay? What stops anybody from laying the boots to them at that point?
Nothing.
Once you get dropped, you might get a 1-2 and somebody rips you off. But once you can't defend yourself in this sport, you only take a limited amount of trauma. Even in boxing, when a guy gets dropped in boxing and he has a concussion and it's obvious, and he gets up and he holds on to make it through another round, he might fight another 25 or 30 minutes that night. He might take another 200-300 punches to the head after he's already been concussed. In MMA, we let it play out because it continues to play out. And it may look more brutal, but in the end, a guy with a concussion taking 2 or 3 punches compared to a guy that's taking 200 or 300 punches, you tell me what's safer,
I heard years ago that UFC messed up the pay-per-view model where they had to pay.
They did. When I first signed into the pay-per-view, I had my first 10,000 buys went back to pay-per-view. And a lot of people weren't willing to step that up. So the UFC kind of froze everybody out by saying, okay, we're going to do this. So if any of the smaller guys want to jump up on pay-per-view and build their market, they're not going to be able to do that. And it was called a favored nation deal with the UFC, 10,000 buys. So as I was doing the pay-per-views in the early days and coming through on 7,500 and 8,000 and 9,000 buys, I had to make up that difference. So I was paying to be on pay-per-view in the early days. Even when Michael Westbrook fought for me, we thought we were going to get huge numbers and we got like 8,000 buys. I still didn't make any money on that deal. The good news is at the end of it, when I had to settle up with them, they let me use my old footage and traded it in to buy off that time. So they never actually made me write a check.
Oh,
but because I was the guy that hung around and kept doing it, But a lot of guys jumped on, did 1 or 2, lost, that first 10,000 buys. That's $300,000 at $30 a buy. So they're keeping the first $300,000, and it crushed all the little guys out.
That was smart by the UFC. You really think about it.
Absolutely.
You wouldn't have done that though if you could.
You know what? On that end, I wouldn't have been smart enough to pull that off.
You wouldn't have thought of that.
Nah, I wouldn't have thought of that. There's a lot of directions I go that I feel pretty crafty on, but television guys are a special. I mean, even when Dana was doing his television in the beginning, I can remember some of the deals he made until they got Marshall Zalaznik involved. Yeah. They had no real television going on in the UFC. Marshall Zalaznik took it, went over to Europe, built the Europe markets for the UFC. Eventually, when the new group came in and purchased it, Marshall Zalaznik got pushed off. But Marshall Zalaznik was my pay-per-view guy. He was the head of pay-per-view out of New York. And he was my guy before they took him. And then once he was no longer they took him and hired him and brought him in. So they had the right people. It was just a matter of the right time and making sure that the right people were making the right decisions.